Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Brotherton here, and we are going to be talking about the evidence for evolution. Alright, so up to this point, we've talked about natural selection, what's going on there, but now we have to talk about, well, how do we know that all of this stuff has happened? The process seems to make sense, but how do we know that all this stuff has happened? Alright, so the first thing I have on here is a picture of an anole. This is a type of lizard that lives in the southeastern United States. Sorry. And the reason I have this picture on here is because we can actually see some of these changes happening within our lifetimes. We've had brown anoles from the Caribbean move into Florida and the southeastern United States, and the green anoles and brown anoles compete with one another, and actually they eat each other's eggs. All right, and so what's happened is just in a couple of generations, green anoles have been selected for having stickier feet, and so they're going further and further and further up into trees to lay their eggs. And so you can see how this population is already changing in a very short period of time, and eventually that could lead to some radical changes in the morphology of these two different anoles if they keep competing like this. All right, so how do we know that evolution has taken place? Well, we have 5 major fields that have evidence for the changes of organisms over time. So paleontology, study of prehistoric life; biogeography, so that's where living things are located and maybe where they came from and how they got there; embryology, so you can look at similarities in embryonic development; anatomy, so the structures, you can compare the actual morphology; plus the biochemistry, so the DNA, maybe some of the cell signaling processes, how things are getting turned on and off, and also the developments. Even the biochemistry actually even goes back to the embryology as well. All right, so let's start with the first one. What's the evidence for evolution in paleontology? Well, there is a whole lot of evidence for evolution in paleontology. All right, so the fossil record gives us a lot to look at to see how things are related. One of the coolest things is the fact that we even have a fossil record, considering how difficult it is for fossils to be made, because they're basically remnants of animal bones, footprints, feces. So fossilized feces are called coprolite, and those are very, very important, surprisingly. You wouldn't think you'd go to college and learn to study poop, but people do, and it's actually really important for us to understand the evolution of even our own gut microbiome. But anyway, fossils are just kind of the remnants of things that used to be walking around a long time ago, and we can see them in rocks, right? And so we have evidence, because of transitional fossils, that link extinct species to current species, and that helps us understand these evolutionary lineages. So the picture I have on here is a picture of an Archaeopteryx, and an Archaeopteryx was basically a transitional species as theropod dinosaurs, so dinosaurs that walked on 2 legs, as they were transitioning into becoming birds, all right, towards the end of the Cretaceous period. And what's really interesting here is actually we've known about the Archaeopteryx since about the 1860s, but in the 1990s, they actually found an older fossil that is basically a theropod dinosaur with feathers. So we have basically, a dinosaur with feathers. We have something that's kind of in between a dinosaur and a bird, and then we have birds. So you can see that things are changing over time. Another example of this is human evolution, right? So right here, I have an Australopithecus afarensis skull, all right? And you can look at this, and this looks very dissimilar from a modern human. If you look at a modern human skull, it's going to look something like this, all right? So how do we get from here, all right, with that kind of sloping forehead and brow ridges, to this, no real brow ridges, really big forehead, no sloping face either? So how do we get there? Well, there's transitional fossils, all right? So if you look, you can kind of see the transition here happening. So Australopithecus 4 million years ago. This is basically a Homo erectus. This is about 2 million years ago, and you can see the difference here. The face is flatter. The forehead is starting to develop. The brow ridges are starting to recede. Then we can zoom forward again. We can come to about 400,000 years ago, and we have a Neanderthalensis. All right, so Homo neanderthalensis. Now we're in our genus. Still not quite our species, but you can see this is starting to look a lot more human-like. the face is now getting flatter, the brow ridges are smaller, and the forehead is getting even larger. So you can see it's not a huge jump to get here. All right, so we have lots and lots of transitional fossils that tell us how things are related. Another thing, evidence of biogeography. So this is basically island species look most closely to the nearest mainland species, all right, not similar islands on the other side of the ocean. So what that means is that these different populations weren't kind of plopped down on these islands and developed independently. They actually radiated from the mainland as maybe islands separated due to tectonic plate movement, or maybe they got stuck on like a log out to sea and colonized these islands. But basically this shows us that things can adaptively radiate into new environments and change over time. And this is what Darwin saw in the Galapagos with his finches. And this is an example of divergent evolution, right? Things can have one original ancestor here and then kind of adapt into these islands and turn into a whole bunch of different species that are suited for their environment. Another example of this would be like marsupials. All right, here in North America, we only have one marsupial. That's the good old possum. Not really a handsome-looking creature, but they are pretty cool. But that's the only marsupial we have here in North America, which is actually where marsupials are from, interestingly enough. But about 100 million years ago, when Australia and North America were still kind of touching, they began to radiate into these new environments. And basically, marsupials here got outcompeted by placental mammals, whereas, say, in Australia, they were free, they had no competition, and they adapted and radiated into all these different species from one original ancestor. You have, everything from a koala to a kangaroo, all coming from the same original founding population of marsupials, which is pretty interesting. All right, what other evidence we have? Embryology. So the embryos of vertebrates are very, very similar in appearance because they used to share a common ancestor, all right? So common ancestry is very, very obvious when you look at the embryological development of these totally different species, right? A fish, a reptile, a bird, and a human are very different in their final development, but if you look at them when they're embryos about 4 weeks into their gestation, you can see that they look very, very similar. And a lot of this is because the original ancestor of all these chordates, which eventually gave rise to vertebrates, all had the same type of development. And so even though these things are totally different in their final stages, when they first start, they're turning on the same exact genes and developing the same way, even to the point that something like a human being that doesn't have a tail, actually about 4 weeks into their gestation, has about 11 or 12 different vertebrae that are developing for a tail, and eventually they get turned off and they go away. All right. So embryological development, similar for vastly different phyla. All right, what other evidence do we have? Well, evidence from anatomy. So we have homologous structures. Homologous means the same. All right, and this is because they result from common ancestry. So they have the same structure, but they might have different functions. So if you look here, humerus, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, that's the basic tetrapod body plan. So a tetrapod is something with 4 limbs. All right, but as these different tetrapods have diverged over time, so say like you, me, a whale, a bat, we have adapted to different environments, but the basic building blocks are exactly the same, and we actually share essentially the same number of bones and the same structures. So if you were to look at something from a human to a bat to a frog to a bird, we all descended from a common ancestor, the first thing to kind of walk on land, like an early Tiktaalik or some kind of early tetrapod. And that first organism had 1 bone here, 2 bones here, and then a couple early wrist bones, and maybe a couple little finger bones. And so we all have that exact same body plan. We just modify it to suit our needs. What other evidence is there? Well, vestigial organs. So these are structures with little or no function. They're no longer needed, but because they used to be needed in an ancestor, they still stick around for a while. So an ostrich that has feathers, does it use its feathers for flying? No, but its ancestor did, so it still has feathers. All right? And this happens due to divergent evolution. So another example, let's say in human beings, is if it's cold, we get goosebumps. The erector pili muscle is a vestigial structure, so it makes our hair stand up. If we were really, really hairy, like some of our mammal brethren, when we get cold and your hair stands up, well, that creates more space in there for heat to get trapped, and so it helps to keep you warm. Another vestigial structure in human beings, here's one right here, the tailbone. So I talked about how we have about 11 or 12 vertebrae developing into a tail during embryological development. Those recede, they get turned off, they get recycled, they apoptose is the fancy word, but we still have a remnant tail. And so you can see it here, a different view from the side. You can kind of see, oh look, that's a tailbone. This is a human pelvis. Humans don't have tails. So that's another vestigial structure from when we did have a tail that we probably shared with our early primate ancestor. More evidence in anatomy is the fact that over time, organisms keep coming up with the same solutions to the same problem. So we call these analogous structures. So they have a similar function, but a different structure, so that they evolved to solve the same problem. So the problem of flight, well, how do you fix that? Wings. But you have to use what you already have based on your ancestors. So, you know, this is an example of convergent evolution where two totally different lineages are solving the same problem in a similar way, and they're using the structures that they had in order to build something new. So yes, a dragonfly and an owl here both have wings, but what actually the structure of their wings is totally different. That owl's wing is way more similar to my arm than it is to that dragonfly's wing. All right, so they're solving the same problem. Same thing with a bat. Another example of convergent evolution here. All right, evidence in biochemistry. So this is really interesting. So things that have the same proteins and the same DNA show us that they are more closely related. So DNA and proteins, if we compare similarities in DNA and amino acid sequences, we can see that things are really, really related. And some super important proteins and DNA sequences really haven't changed too much, and we call those conserved proteins. So an example is CDK, or cyclin-dependent kinase. It's important in cell signaling and the cell cycle. So you can actually take a CDK from a yeast and put it in a human, and it would still work no problem at all. And humans and yeast diverged 1 billion years ago. All right? So a pseudogene, once again, similar thing. It's kind of like a vestigial gene. And Hox genes, which direct body plans in both vertebrates and invertebrates. So that's even going back even further, and it's telling us, okay, the development of things from conception to birth is a very regulated process, and things that are totally different, so like an ant or, I don't know, like a sponge or whatever, is still using the same genes, maybe in a different way. All right? So we can look at how a hippopotamus and a humpback whale are related because maybe their biochemistry and their DNA sequences are very, very similar. All right? So here's an example of a human to a chimp to a mouse to a zebrafish to a chicken to a fruit fly to a roundworm to baker's yeast. You can kind of see the percentage of similarity there. As these things have diverged, their DNA sequences have diverged, but they still share a lot of sequences in common. All right, and here's an example of the Hox genes. Here's a human being. Here's a fruit fly, and you can see we have very similar Hox genes in humans. They've just multiplied a bunch of times, but you can kind of see the timing of their development and what they control is the same. So you can see, say, like, this pink region is being turned on, or this pink and red gene is being turned on to control the development of the head. Well, it's doing the same thing in a human being that it's doing in a fruit fly. All right, that's it for today. Stay curious, guys, and peace.